decided to leave Israel, which was the promised land that God had given their people, and go to Moab, which was a land that worshipped false gods and didn't know God. So they were leaving for Moab because of good farming. Uh, but in Moab, Elimelech died, as did both his sons, leaving Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, as widows. These three women were alone and in a dire situation. Naomi decided to return to her homeland of Israel. But because she knew it would be harder for Ruth and Orpah in Israel, she encouraged them to stay in Moab and remarry. Orpah decided to leave Naomi and stay in Moab, and Ruth resolved to love Naomi and resolved to love Naomi's God and went with her to Israel. So, in there we also see that Ruth, she said she was going to follow Naomi's God. So it's also a conversion story that happened there. Ruth, who was a Moabite and would have been worshiping the Moabites' false gods, decided to convert to, it would have been Judaism back then, but convert to follow the one true God. And so she decided to risk going back to a place that would be a harder life, but to show love to her mother-in-law and show love to God. So let's look at Ruth. We'll continue on. So we'll start with Ruth chapter 1, verses 22 through chapter 2, verses 3. Again, I'm reading out of the New Living Translation, which will be up on the screen. But if you can follow along in whatever Bible you have, if you like, as well. So yeah, Ruth chapter 1, verse 22 through chapter 2, verse 3. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. So Naomi and Ruth are back in Israel, trying to survive as widows. As we talked about last week, that was a very hard life, but there was a law in Jewish culture called Pia, and part of Pia was providing for widows and other poor people. So that was one of the several laws. And so in Pia was basically a law that stated when people harvested their fields, they should not go all the way to every edge, but they were supposed to leave the corners so that people who didn't have anything could come and harvest what they left on the corners. Pia was kind of a complicated law that had several other details to it, but part of it was, where was I? They were supposed to leave at least 1/60th of their field. That's 60, not 16. 60, not 16. So 1/60th of their field, which is not a ton of food they're leaving in their fields. Pia stated that they shouldn't go all the way to the edges. Leave the corners. And when they were harvesting, it also said to leave behind what they fell out of their bundles. So to explain what that means, I have some pictures. If you have the first one, Todd. This is modern day Israel, but you can see they were using like the old harvesting methods where they'd go through the barley fields and they'd grab a armful of barley in one hand and use like that little curved blade to cut it down at the bottom. And here, because modern day, they're sticking it in bags, but they used to just cut it and make big piles. And then I think the next picture, they had like people would come after them. Typically it was the women or other workers who weren't doing the cutting. They'd leave these big piles. They'd come, gather up the big pile, tie it up, and carry it off as he's carrying it off. And so Pia stated that if when you're doing that, if you leave some, like you drop some, just leave it, and widows and poor people could come and pick it up. And then I just had there was a painting of someone's depiction of Ruth picking up what was left behind from the bundles. So that was in Pia. You leave the corners and you leave what you drop. But the big portion, like they try not to leave a bunch from the piles. So mostly what they're leaving is the edges and the corners, which if you've ever driven through cornfields, you might have noticed the stuff on the very end near the road tends to not be as tall and not as good. So they're leaving behind, in general, the worst parts of their field, And so there really wasn't that much that they were leaving. I would imagine the PL law was also quite a bit like tithing today, where it's encouraged to leave this percentage, but not necessarily everyone's doing it, and not necessarily the exact percentage they're supposed to. So it was actually quite hard to provide for yourself that way. There's some scholars who equated it to modern day people picking up pop cans and other aluminum along the side of the roads, that it's hard work, it can be kind of demeaning or embarrassing work, and after working all day, you might have just barely enough money to provide a simple meal. So that's basically what they were doing. In our story, it is barley harvest, and Ruth goes out to a field so she can work and try and get enough barley to provide for her and Naomi. She ends up finding her way into a field that's owned by a man named Boaz. So let's look farther into the story. So Ruth chapter 2, verses 4 through 13. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter." Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I am only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers." So finally in our story, we see something good happening to Ruth. Up until this point, it's always been bad things. Her husband had died, she'd gone to a foreign land, all these bad things happened, but now finally, there's some good things happening. At this point, Ruth did not know that Boaz was a relative of Naomi's. Boaz must have known, and clearly had heard about what Ruth did by being willing to come back with Naomi, as I talked about last week. Ruth was really risking and sacrificing quite a bit to come back to Israel with Naomi, rather than staying in Moab. And clearly the news of that had traveled, and Boaz appreciated how Ruth was showing his relative love. Also, Ruth was working hard in the field, so Boaz could see her work ethic. The combination of Ruth's work ethic and her resolve to love Naomi made Boaz like her and want to help her. But with Ruth not knowing that this was Boaz's field, and Ruth not knowing that Boaz was her relative, how did she end up in this field? The Bible doesn't say for sure, but I think that it's a demonstration of God caring for and providing for Ruth. God led Ruth to that specific field because he knew that that was her relative and that Boaz would show favor on her and help take care of her. So, Ruth had resolved to love God in the previous chapter, and God's responding to her commitment to love him by leading her to where she needs to be able to be blessed and be able to take care of herself and Naomi. And then also perhaps God was speaking to Boaz specifically as well. Boaz does point, where is it, in 12, "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come, take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." So Boaz is taking care of her, but he does mention that it's because of God that he's showing her favor and providing for her. So let's keep reading. Ruth chapter 2, verses 14 through 23. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with the harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives and one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's field and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. So here we see even more blessing being given to Ruth. Boaz lets her eat with him and his workers, which would be very uncommon. He ordered his workers to keep her safe. So typically the main workers working in the field probably didn't like the people who were coming and getting what they left behind, which were called gleaners. They were probably often in the way and just frustrating the workers who were doing hard work for pay, and they feel like they're just getting free stuff, even though really they're not. So he ordered his workers to treat her well and not like give her a hard time. And he was also having them intentionally leave barley behind for her. And so in the law of Pia, it was actually specifically said not to show favoritism to certain widows and homeless people, because that way there's some for everyone. So he's not really exactly breaking the law, because it is his grain, and if he wants to drop it on the ground, he can. But he's definitely like in a gray area, pushing the laws of what is required, and clearly showing favoritism to Ruth. So anyone who was living in that culture would see what he's doing and know that he's clearly favoring her and giving her things that they normally wouldn't for widows. Here we see that Naomi knows Boaz is a relative as well. This takes us back to the Jewish law we talked about last week, which was called Yibum, where if a woman's husband dies, a brother would typically marry the widow. But in Ruth's case, the brother was also dead. But there were other relatives, typically called a kinsman redeemer, or in Hebrew, it's Gael, who could marry the widow. We see that Naomi sees that Boaz is a relative, and he seems to be treating Ruth extra nice. So they think that might be leading up to something. Now, this is only a couple of verses, but it says that she stayed through the whole barley harvest and then the whole wheat harvest. So even though it's a couple verses, it's several weeks at least, likely several months. So Ruth is there. She's working in Boaz's field every day and sharing meals with them. So they're having some time to get to know each other, even though it doesn't really go into detail of that. We also want to quickly point out that this chapter I titled Love's Response. Last week, chapter 1 was Love's Resolve. So as I already mentioned, Ruth resolved to love God, and then God's or love's response was to help provide for Ruth. So we'll continue and look at chapter 3. We'll just read all of chapter 3 as one long piece. One day, Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, it's time that I found a permanent home for you, so that you will be provided for. Boaz is a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight, he'll be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Now do as I tell you. Take a bath and put on perfume, and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down there. He will tell you what to do." "I will do everything you say," Ruth replied. So she went down to the threshing floor that night and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman laying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," Boaz exclaimed. "You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows you are a virtuous woman. But while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there is another man who is more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. If he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he is not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. Now lie down here until morning." So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until the morning, but she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other. For Boaz had said, "No one must know that a woman was here at the threshing floor." Then Boaz said to her, "Bring your cloak and spread it out." He measured 6 scoops of barley onto the cloak and placed it on her back. Then he returned to the town. When Ruth went back to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "What happened, my daughter?" Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for her, and she added, "He gave me these 6 scoops of barley and said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said to her, "Just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today." So this part of the story is where it can often seem really weird for people, and people tend to have a lot of questions. A lot of people are unsure whether this is some sort of reference to something more going on. Was Ruth sleeping with Boaz? What was it was something weird or inappropriate? The answer is really a simple no. In Jewish culture, it was custom that if someone accepted a marriage proposal, the man would put his cloak over the woman, and that was signifying the man was providing for and protecting and like covering the woman with his protection. Um, so in the modern day, we have a ring as a sign of commitment to each other. Back then, they used a cloak as that sign of commitment to each other. They'd cover her with a cloak. And so that was really what's happening here. Ruth was simply laying close enough to Boaz so that if he chose to cover her with his blanket, he could. It seems super weird to us, but it's something that someone living in that culture would understand. Essentially, it was a marriage proposal. And so that's not a point I'm going to like dwell on for too long, but I would say in Ruth took the initiative and she proposed essentially. And so there's biblical evidence for both the man leading in a dating relationship and the woman leading. So just if people say that like the man has to lead all the time, that is more of a cultural thing than a biblical thing. In the Bible, both happen. So, but that's a different topic. But just one thing I was going to throw in there is that it can be both. Let's see, where is that? So she did do this at night, which is a little odd, and the text doesn't say for sure why it was at night. I have found conflicting answers when I researched it, but I suspect that they were avoiding embarrassment if Boaz were to say no, or if, in the case that it actually was where Boaz wasn't allowed to because there was a closer relative, Naomi and Ruth were just avoiding the embarrassment of like a public refusal. Also in the next chapter, we'll see that Boaz kind of tricks the other closer relative, and so perhaps he probably wanted her to leave early in the morning so that he could be a bit more sneaky in the next chapter, which we'll get to next week. But basically, they was just done at night so that it wasn't a big embarrassment. So this was essentially a marriage proposal and a request. That's why I called this chapter Love's Request. Ruth showed her interest in a marriage, and Boaz agreed. But now we hear that there is a different person who, according to the Yabim law, which we have talked about before, he must either marry Ruth or publicly state that he doesn't want to. So Boaz agrees that if he can, he will marry Ruth, but they have to follow the customary step of checking with the other relative first. Boaz also shows his care for Ruth by sending her home with plenty of grain. I would also like to point out that Boaz is praising Ruth for her loyalty to her mother-in-law and for sticking to the Jewish tradition, rather than seeking someone outside of the family. This, I think, shows more of Ruth's genuine conversion. So, I mean, Ruth didn't used to be, she wasn't Jewish, so these were new customs for her too, and so it might be more normal for her to try to just do what she's used to, but she converted to following God, and these were God's laws at the time. And so you can see that it was a genuine conversion, and she's trying her best to follow God's will at the time. Ruth had also been in the area for a few weeks now. It seemed like she had immediately won Boaz over with her good work ethic in his field. And now Boaz says that the whole town knows she's a virtuous woman. So clearly, she was hardworking in his field and made a good name for herself in the town, even though widows were outcasts and she was a widow and poor, and so people wouldn't normally really acknowledge her. They kind of just ignore her, but she was clearly virtuous enough that people had started noticing. So in summary of these two chapters, we see the contrast to chapter 1. In chapter 1, Naomi and Elimelech chose to make the decision that looked profitable, but that took them away from God, and it went bad. Ruth made the decision that looked hard, but brought her closer to God, and it's been working out very well for her. So my application for this week is similar to last week's. Last week I said to look at the decisions in your life, and look at what will bring you closer to God, and choose the path towards God, even if it is harder. But this week we also see that Ruth's work ethic and her virtuousness is what attracted Boaz to her, which is essentially what's bringing her closer to God's reward. So she didn't even know she was in his fields originally, and she wasn't expecting anything from him, but she was just working her hardest to help provide for Naomi. So my application this week would be to do what's stated later on in the Bible in the New Testament, which is to do everything you do as if you're doing it for the Lord. Work hard in providing for and caring for others, whether you are getting the recognition for it or not, and know that God sees and will provide for your needs as you work to help others. So don't worry about, does your work get noticed, or are you working in a place where you'll get a lot of reward for what you're doing, but just seek God on to where he wants you, and work your hardest in serving God and serving others in the place that he put you. And then next week we'll go into the last chapter, and then I'll also do a whole overview of Ruth, pulling out a few more things, showing God's redemptive character. But yeah, that's it for this week. Thanks for coming. Bye. I forgot. I do have one slide of the sources again, just because I don't do the handouts in the bulletin. So if you want sources, there's a slide. I know Richard was doing more studying. The Jewish Learning, my Jewish Learning is a really cool website if you happen to be doing more studying like Richard was. But yeah, there's some sources.